In the 2023 film Fast X, directed by Louis Leterrier, the characters of the Fast and Furious franchise continue their epic adventures led by the stoic Dominic Toretto, played by Vin Diesel. In this video, we'll explore how the filmmakers create cinematic shots incorporating various visual elements, including camera placement, composition, movement, and lighting. Per usual, there will be spoilers to the story of Fast X, so I recommend checking it out before proceeding further. As a general story overview, Fast X takes the audience back to events that happened in the fifth film and seeing how the consequences of that film play out in present day. A new villain, Dante Reyes, played by Jason Momoa, is introduced into the series, and his extensive plans for revenge against Dom and his surrogate family, spanning vast locations around the world, involving complicated plots of entrapment and specific targeting. Dom and his gang are forced to battle with their wits and physicality to escape many of Dante's traps, while figuring out how to reach the end game. In cinematic shot number 1, we see Dante on a motorcycle approaching one of the agency's vehicles, which is on screen right. The camera is low to the ground, moving with the vehicles and using a wide-angle lens to get a full view of the action and the environment. The agency vehicle acts as a foreground element, while the ground plane appears at the bottom of the frame, probably taking up less than 25% of the total frame area. There's a slight 3-point perspective grid within the frame informed by the perspective cues on the buildings, plus motion blur appears on the edges of the camera frame, with the fast-paced action happening within the shot. In cinematic shot number 2, the camera is placed high above the ground, pointed downward in a down shot, showing Letty chasing after Dante, each on their own motorcycle. The strong perspective lines formed by the buildings help to create a 3-point perspective within the grid, and we can clearly see the ground plane of the street below. This kind of shot helps us to reorient ourselves and get a sense of the space being covered during an action scene. From this shot, the filmmakers might cut into tighter shots closer to the ground on the action. In cinematic shot number 3, Letty uses her motorcycle to swivel over a gate that appears in the foreground. On either side of her, we see buildings that convey the tight space along the street. The perspective lines of the buildings help to create a slight 3-point perspective grid. The camera actually moves with Letty as she heads towards the camera, creating a dynamic feel to the shot. In cinematic shot number 4, we see an exuberant Dante in the middle of the shot with extensive motion blur at the edges of the camera frame. Dante is riding his motorcycle, moving quickly along the street in between a row of buildings on either side of the shot. The perspective lines of the windows helps us to determine the location of the horizon line. The camera lens is likely a little wider, allowing us to see Dante in this spatial environment and adding the motion blur to the shot. In cinematic shot number 5, we see Dom and Dante facing off during a street racing event in Rio. Both characters are generally in profile view, although we see a little more of a 3/4 position on Dom, in that we see both of his eyes in the frame. Meanwhile, we only see one of Dante's eyes in this profile view. Space is flattened in the shot as we don't see as many strong perspective lines. Instead, the filmmakers use the crowd of street racers and onlookers in the background, slightly out of focus as textures in the shot to create spatial depth. An off-screen light source lights the back of Dante's head and adds some edge light on Dom, creating a more foreboding feel to their confrontation, as both Dom and Dante's faces are mostly in shadow. In cinematic shot number 6, we see Jacob Toretto and Dom's son, Lil B, inside a customized, rugged car fleeing from Dante's henchmen. The camera is placed inside the car using a wider angle lens so that we can see the expansive space around Jacob and Lil B. Both Jacob and Lil B's heads are framed by parts of the windows inside the car, creating frame-within-a-frame elements, organizing them in the visual space. The background terrain outside the car appears slightly out of focus, helping to enhance spatial depth. In cinematic shot number 7, we see a wide shot, helping us to see the environmental context and spatial orientation of the cars in this car chase scene. The ground plane is visible along with the background terrain, which tells us these characters are far away from a populated, civilized setting. The number of Dante's henchmen is also conveyed by the army of cars chasing after Jacob and Lil B. The camera is likely using a wide-angle lens, taking advantage of the bright outdoor light that keeps all the visual details clear and pristine. In cinematic shot number 8, the camera is back inside the car, showing Jacob and Lil B still fleeing from the henchmen. The camera is likely using a slightly wider lens, and there are strong perspective lines formed by the windows and structural elements of the car. Jacob's head is framed by the back window, and Lil B's head is framed by the front passenger side window. One thing to note is that both characters have changed screen direction from an earlier shot in the scene, and this usually doesn't distract us, as crossing the 180-degree line during an action scene is easily achieved with appropriate cuts. In cinematic shot number 9, the camera is placed low inside the car, tilted upward, creating an upshot on Lil B as he reaches for a lever and pulls it to battle the pursuing henchmen. We can see a 3-point perspective grid formed by the structural elements inside the car, and the camera lens is likely a little wider, allowing us to see Lil B inside the car, while also being aware of the structural elements around him. In cinematic shot number 10, the camera is placed close to Jacob's car, showing a forced perspective on the vehicle. The ground plane and sky plane are clearly visible, and some of the background terrain appears on screen left. Putting the camera close to the car and its back tire places the viewer closer to the action, conveying the thrill and dynamic movement happening in the scene. We feel like we are right there, following the action. In cinematic shot number 11, we see Roman Pierce driving through the streets of Rome. He's framed on screen left, and his position helps to reflect how the rule of thirds can be used in composing a shot. We see part of the background showing buildings and trees flying by quickly. Roman is looking off screen towards screen right as he drives. The front passenger window helps to act as a framing element around Roman, putting him in a specific spatial area within the frame. In cinematic shot number 12, we see Dom answering the phone being taunted by Dante. The lighting scheme and color scheme within the shot plays an important role. Dom is mostly bathed in muted orange tungsten light, while the background elements are colored in muted blues and greens. There's a source light appearing within the frame that helps to add an edge light to the side of Dom's face. The background elements are blurred out of focus, creating a sense of spatial depth. The muted lighting on Dom's face helps to convey his grim thoughts and situation. In cinematic shot number 13, a classic over-the-shoulder shot is created with Dante in the foreground out of focus. Meanwhile, the camera is pointed toward Dom, who is more on screen left with his eye line directed toward Dante. Dom is more clearly lit in the scene from an off-screen light that is somewhere on screen right. The street racers in the background form crowd textures, creating spatial depth as they're out of focus. In cinematic shot number 14, the camera is placed higher above ground, creating a down shot pointed toward the crowd below. Using a wider angle lens, the camera placement helps us to see the three-point perspective grid formed by the orientation of the crowd members within the frame, and also some slight distortion at the edges of the frame. Composition of the shot helps us to see the massiveness of the crowd around Dom and Dante as they face off, giving us a sense of what's at stake when they pull out guns and point them at each other. In cinematic shot number 15, a traditional close-up on Deckard Shaw is informed by the lighting scheme and color scheme within the frame. Deckard's eye line is looking towards screen left, and he's mostly bathed in a muted orange tungsten light. Behind him, the background is made up of colder blue tones, contrasting with the warmer light on Deckard. This contrast helps to separate Deckard from the background and allows us to concentrate on what he is thinking through his facial expression. In cinematic shot number 16, we see Cypher reacting to her fight with Letty. The warmer skin and hair tones in Cypher contrast with a strip of blue light behind her on the walls. The strip also helps to act as a visual guideline, drawing our view to her eyes as well as conveying a sense of spatial depth as it stretches into the background. The ceiling light on screen left and other light reflections on the background walls also help to add visual texture to the background, creating a pattern that separates them from Cypher in the foreground. In cinematic shot number 17, we see a new character, Tess, firing a gun as she moves in to help Dom during a battle on a bridge in Rio. The horizon line and background terrain stretch across the frame, moving our eyes toward Tess's face so we can focus in on her expression. Also, a lot of the color scheme in the background elements are muted or washed out by the outdoor light so that the blue jacket worn by Tess helps us to focus in on her and her acting. The camera is likely using a wider angle lens to capture Tess in this environment. In cinematic shot number 18, we see another over-the-shoulder shot with Dom in the foreground on screen left, with the camera pointed toward Tess, who is more on screen right. The color scheme and lighting scheme help to inform the visual design of the shot. Tess is mostly bathed in warmer, orange tungsten light, while the background to the left of her is mostly colder blue light. The area of the background to her right is mostly warmer, informed by a source light that is somewhat behind Tess in this frame. The warmer light on Tess helps to convey her character as a new ally to Dom and his gang. So overall, these technical descriptions of shots in Fast X can help us to better understand how to use filmmaking language, whether in dialogue scenes, high-intensity action scenes, or anything else in between these two extremes. The aesthetic choices made by the filmmakers are reflected in how these shots are designed, which are integral parts of the storytelling.